Welcome back to Vuln Vibes, everybody. Today we're diving into a fresh batch of WordPress vulnerabilities, the really serious ones, the highs and criticals.
Yeah, we're going to keep it tight and focused, assuming you're already up to speed on things like MITRE, ATT, and CK, and all that.
Right to the point. No need to rehash the basics here. We've got a pretty solid set of advisories to work with.
Absolutely. And the goal is to sift through all that and extract those nuggets of wisdom, those key trends that'll really make a difference in your day-to-day security work.
Exactly. So let's jump right in, shall we? We've got this WPCS plugin, the WordPress Currency Switcher Professional, up to version 1.2.0.4.
Yeah, that one's got an unauthenticated arbitrary shortcode execution vulnerability.
Okay, so break that down for me a little bit. What's going on under the hood that makes this so dangerous?
Basically, the plugin's not doing enough to validate input before it executes the do shortcode function.
Do shortcode. For those who might not be super familiar with WordPress templating, what exactly does that mean in practice?
So shortcodes, you can think of them as like little shortcuts for embedding dynamic content on a page.
Okay, so like a quick way to pull in a contact form or display a recent post or something.
Exactly. But here's the problem. If the plugin isn't properly sanitizing the input that's fed into this do shortcode function, an attacker can sneak in malicious code.
So they're basically hijacking these shortcuts to make the site do things it shouldn't.
Precisely. And the scary part is the potential impact. Depending on what other plugins are installed and the shortcuts they offer, an attacker could manipulate content, activate rogue plugins, all sorts of nasty stuff.
All without even needing to log in. That's a pretty significant attack surface we're talking about.
It is, and it really underscores the constant balancing act in web development. You want to make things easy and flexible for users, but that can sometimes come at the expense of security.
Right. You're always trying to find that sweet spot between functionality and risk. It's a theme we see popping up again and again.
Absolutely. Now, moving on, we have the Husky UI plugin, the Products Filter Professional for WooCommerce, versions up to 1.3.6.5.
And this one's got a local file inclusion vulnerability, LFI. Still a big problem, apparently.
Unfortunately, yeah. This one's exploitable through the template parameter in the WooF text search AJX action.
Okay, lots of jargon there. AJX, we know that's for those dynamic website updates, right?
Yeah.
Makes things snappy and responsive.
Right. And in this case, it's become an unexpected entry point for attackers. See, the template parameter, it's meant to tell the plugin which file to use for displaying search results.
Right. Makes sense.
But the problem is it doesn't properly validate the file path that's provided, so an attacker can slip in a path to any file on the server.
And then the plugin tries to load and execute that file, potentially giving the attacker control of the system.
Exactly. And the sneaky thing about LFI is that it can lead to indirect remote code execution. Imagine an attacker uploads a seemingly harmless file, like an image, but hides malicious code in the metadata.
So it bypasses the usual upload security checks because it looks like an innocent file type. So,
Right. And then they use the LFI vulnerability to trick the server into executing that hidden code within the image. Bam, full control.
the classic upload and include maneuver. It really highlights the importance of input validation across the board, not just user forms, but anything the application accepts.
Absolutely. You got to be vigilant about sanitizing every bit of data that comes in.
So what's next on our vulnerability hit list?
Next up, we have the WP Recall Plugin Registration Profile, Commerce, and More, up to versions 16.2, 6.10. This one's got a SQL injection vulnerability.
SQL injection, a real blast from the past. You'd think we'd have this one figured out by now.
You'd hope so, right? But it remains a persistent threat, unfortunately. And in this case, it's all about the data beat parameter.
Okay, for those who might not be totally familiar with the ins and outs of databases, what exactly is SQL injection and why is it so dangerous?
In simple terms, SQL injection lets an attacker manipulate database queries. They can potentially read sensitive data, modify data, even delete data.
And in this case, it's the data beat parameter that's vulnerable. What's the specific weakness there?
The plugin isn't properly escaping the input from that parameter, and the SQL query itself isn't well prepared. This opens the door for an attacker to inject malicious code into the database interaction.
So it's like they're speaking the database's language, but with malicious intent.
Exactly. And the immediate impact observed here is data exfiltration. An attacker could potentially steal sensitive information like user credentials, financial data, all sorts of stuff.
A stark reminder that even seemingly basic security practices, like using parameterized queries and escaping user input, are absolutely crucial.
Couldn't agree more. Now let's shift gears a bit and look at some authenticated vulnerabilities. We have the SMTP by Best WebSoft plugin up to version 1.1.9.
Authenticated meaning you need to be logged in to exploit it right.
Correct. This one requires administrator-level access or higher, which brings up an interesting point.
Yeah, it's not always about keeping unauthorized users out. Sometimes it's about managing privileges and validating actions even within a trusted session.
Exactly. In this case, we're dealing with an arbitrary file upload vulnerability.
So an admin user could potentially abuse this. What exactly is the flaw that allows this unauthorized upload?
The save options function is missing a crucial check. It doesn't validate the type of file being uploaded.
So an attacker with admin privileges could upload anything they wanted, potentially a malicious script that could take over the server.
Exactly. While the immediate impact might seem limited to file storage, the consequences could be dire. Depending on the server configuration and the attacker's skill, a cleverly crafted file could lead to remote code execution.
It's a classic example of why the principle of least privilege is so important. Even administrators shouldn't have more access than they absolutely need. And of course, robust input validation is essential for any file upload, regardless of the user's role.
Absolutely. Now the next one is almost hard to believe. The Allow PHP Execute plugin, up to version 1.0.
That name alone sends shivers down my spine. It sounds like it's practically begging for trouble.
You're not wrong. And as you might guess, it's a PHP code injection vulnerability.
Okay, so this plugin essentially lets users with unfiltered HTML capabilities inject PHP code directly into posts and pages.
Yep, you got it. And typically users with editor-level access and above have this unfiltered HTML privilege.
So if an attacker compromises an editor account, they've essentially got a built-in backdoor to execute code on the server.
It's a stark reminder that bypassing standard security mechanisms, even with authentication in place, is a recipe for disaster. You really got to be careful with unfiltered HTML permissions and anything that allows direct code execution.
It's all about understanding the potential consequences of every feature and setting appropriate safeguards. All right, what's our last vulnerability for today?
Last but not least, we have the Post Metadata Manager plugin up to version 1.4.3. This one's a multi-site privilege escalation vulnerability.
Multi-site always adds an extra layer of complexity, doesn't it? Multiple interconnected sites, different user roles, it's a lot to keep track of.
Absolutely. And in this case, the plugin doesn't properly check whether it's running in a multi-site environment before allowing modifications to user metadata.
So what's the potential impact of that?
Well, imagine an admin on the main network site. They shouldn't have elevated privileges on individual subsites, right?
Right. Each subsite should have its own admin and user roles.
Exactly. But because of this vulnerability, the main site admin could manipulate metadata in a way that grants them unauthorized access to those subsites.
So they could potentially take control of the entire network just by exploiting this one flaw.
It's a major breach of the principle of least privilege, and it highlights the unique challenges of securing multi-site installations. Developers need to be very careful about context-aware checks and actions that could have cross-site implications.
It's all about thinking through those complex scenarios and making sure your code is robust enough to handle them.
Agreed. So taking a step back and looking at these vulnerabilities as a whole, what key trends emerge?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is that input validation is still absolutely critical. We see it time and again, attackers exploiting weaknesses in how applications handle user input to gain control or steal data.
Absolutely. And it's not just about fancy new attack vectors. Good old-fashioned SQL injection and LFI are still very much in play.
It's a reminder that the fundamentals of security are still relevant, and we can't afford to let our guard down even for a moment.
Right. And the other big takeaway is that security isn't just about keeping unauthorized users out. It's also about managing privileges and enforcing secure coding practices, even for features intended for trusted users.
Because even a logged-in administrator can cause serious damage if the application isn't designed with security in mind.
Exactly. So for our listeners out there, I challenge you to think about these vulnerabilities and the attack sectors we've discussed. How could a sophisticated attacker chain these exploits together to achieve their goals? What kind of damage could they inflict? And how does this snapshot of WordPress vulnerabilities align with the broader trends you're seeing in web application security? Because ultimately, the more we understand these patterns, the better prepared we'll be to defend against them.
Excellent points. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into WordPress security. Stay vigilant out there, everyone, and we'll catch you next time on Vlon Vibes.